Ladies and gentlemen, Wrestling Observer is here with two legends of the sport. We are here with Pat Miletich and the voice Michael Schiavello. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
All right, first question, I'm going to direct it to Mr. Schiavello. How did you get the nickname The Voice?
I got given the nickname The Voice in 1996, 97, somewhere around there, by a guy called Andy Raymond, a very famous rugby commentator and former fight commentator in Australia for Fox Sports. Andy and I were working together at Fox Sports at the time, and he originally deemed me the voice behind the violence, and then eventually that got cut down to just The Voice. So you can blame or thank Andy Raymond of Fox Sports Australia for that one.
Well, speaking of Fox Sports Australia, that was one of my other questions, was how did you get that deal? How did you first come into Fox Sports?
I was 20 years old at the time when I first got asked to commentate a kickboxing show. I'd never commentated martial arts of any form before, but I was into kickboxing and I was doing a lot of writing for some martial arts magazines. So I gave it a shot. And then just when I turned 21, Foxtel, which is cable television, came to Australia, and Fox Sports was set up, and they started broadcasting kickboxing fights, and they'd heard my commentary on a few small promotions and the videos that floated out there, and they basically rang me, and I was 21 years old, and said, "Hey, do you want a job commentating for us?" And I said, "Yep," and been doing it ever since, and I'm about to turn 39 years old in about a month's time.
All right. Well, I'm going to piggyback off that over to Mr. Miletich, because you had a long and successful career as a fighter before you got into commentating. So what made you decide to jump over to the commentary side?
To be honest with you, I was sitting in Chicago O'Hare Airport, was having a real bad day actually, and got a call from David Dinkins, the executive producer at Showtime Sports, and he called me up, introduced himself, and asked if I wanted to try doing one show while Frank Shamrock was fighting Nick Diaz, and after the show said I did a decent job, and said, you want to keep doing it? I said, absolutely.
Do you find it's more challenging than fighting, or about
it can be? It can. I mean, obviously they both have their challenges. Coaching also. It's just fun to see the sport from outside the cage in the way we get to.
Now, obviously, you've had the success you had in UFC, and then you have the Miletich fighting systems, which has given a lot of fighters a lot of success. So, do you ever feel it's a conflict when you have a Miletich fighter on a show, and you've also been a coach for them in the past?
Well, anymore, I really don't coach a whole lot anymore. There's no conflict then at all. Do I have favoritism when I called a Rob Lawler fight for Strikeforce? I never hid it. I told the fans at home, listen, obviously I love Rob. He's like a little brother to me. Things like that, I'm not going to hide it. And do my best not to be partial in my commentary of who's doing what well. But, so, no conflict.
All right, and back to Mr. Schiavello. I want to ask, when did you first decide that you could do commentary? What gave you the first urge to do it?
16 years old, there was an offer from a couple of friends of mine to join them commentating a huge athletic event, track and field meet in Melbourne, where all the private schools would join together and have their annual championship. And, to be honest with you, to me it seemed like a way to wag school at the time, get off an afternoon of schoolwork and go to Olympic Park in Melbourne and, basically miss 4 or 5 hours of school. And they threw me behind the microphone, and I discovered I had a natural talent for it. And, after that, I loved it. Started commentating some soccer and some Australian rules football, and one thing led to another, but that was pretty much how I got into it. It was originally a method to wag school for 4 or 5 hours, and I ended up loving it.
Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I did a little research before this interview, and it says that you were part of the biggest pay-per-view in Australian history, Bobby Green and Anthony Mundine.
Danny Green and
Danny
Anthony
Green.
Mundine. One of the biggest pay-per-views proportionally of all time, when you consider that Australia, that fight was in 2006 in Sydney, and they got 35,000 live fans there to the Sydney Football Stadium. That was the biggest boxing event in Australian history. Huge rivalry between Danny Green and Anthony Mundine. It had built up for quite some time. Biggest money fight ever in Australian boxing history. And when you consider Australia has 20 million people, and the pay-per-view figures they did, I can't even remember the actual figure, but it was astounding. Proportionately, if you put that against most big pay-per-views around the world, it was right up there. When you consider, America has 300 million plus people, Australia only has 20 million, and every pub, club was full all over Australia that night. Everyone that had cable TV at home that could book it on pay-per-view did. It was just the most talked about sports event, I think, of 2006. that and the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne were just huge. The two big sport events of the year.
So, has anything you've done for Access TV so far topped that, or do you consider that the peak so far?
It's hard to say what a peak is. I've got other peaks, I suppose. For me, commentating the Olympic Games in Beijing in 2008, I think was probably the peak for me. I mean, to get to say to my kids and my grandkids, hey, your old man was an Olympic Games commentator is a thing few people can say. And to have an actual Olympic medal given to you by the IOC, which was given to all the commentators at the games, is something that few people have in their chest of drawers, I suppose. So for me, I think that was probably the highlight of the career was maybe doing the Olympic Games in Beijing in 2008.
All right, well, I'm piggybacking off that to Mr. Miletich. What do you consider the biggest fight you've called so far as a commentator?
Well, there were several in Strikeforce. You have to remember, for me, number one, I've been hit a lot. Two, as a fighter, there were a lot of fights. As a coach, thousands of fights. As a commentator, there have been thousands of fights. So there's been a lot of amazing fights that we've seen here on Access TV, that I saw with Showtime. So really, to be honest with you, there have been a lot of them. But being able to sit and watch Fedor fight live was amazing for me. But also, when we do lion fights and seeing great stadium champions, Muay Thai world champions fight right in front of you, as a guy growing up in the Midwest who never had the chance to see those guys live, it's amazing.
Well, I'll piggyback off that to a specific question about your career then. When you look back at the fights you had, was winning the welterweight title your biggest accomplishment, or would you rate something else?
At the time, maybe it was. I look at it now like it's a different life altogether. I think my biggest accomplishment as a fighter was surviving with Dan Severn, probably. Beating a guy that was 220 pounds, that was number one ranked cruiserweight boxer in the world, who was also an Oklahoma State wrestling champ. A very tough Cherokeean named Jason Nicholson from Oklahoma, who was a really, really scary guy. So things like that, fights that people have never really seen. That happened in Hawaii years ago, but things like that stand out to me more than anything else.
Well, and speaking of fights people haven't seen, recently UFC launched their Fight Pass service, so a lot of fans may be getting to see your fights for the first time. Do you feel a sense of accomplishment knowing now that people will be able to go back and see how you kind of set the standard in a lot of ways? Well,
it'd be fun maybe for people to see a little bit of the history of the sport and some of the guys that were, trying to make things happen for the sport early on. It's nice. I've had people tweet me of late a lot about that. So it's nice. It's nice that the newer fans are getting able to go back and see things.
All right, over to Mr. Schiavello again. What made you decide to do the Voice Versus series, or did somebody from Access TV approach you about the series?
No, that was my idea. What happened was in 2009 when UFC came to Australia, I went to Sydney for the show, and Joe Rogan was always my favourite commentator in mixed martial arts and had become a friend of mine. And Joe had never appeared on the network, never on the old HD net as it was then. So I said to the guys at the network, I said, hey, how about I get an interview with Joe for Inside MMA? We'll get him in his hotel room, do a 10, 15-minute interview, and you guys can chop it up. And they said, okay. So contacted my old Fox Sports producer, and we hired just one camera and a couple of camera guys in my hotel room, and Joe came and did the interview. And instead of lasting 10 or 15 minutes, it lasted 75 minutes. And, back then, I was very new on the American scene, so there were a lot of internet forums that were always putting the Voice versus Joe Rogan, who's the better commentator, which is stupid, but it was always funny to read what they were saying.
Was that on the Underground?
You know what, it might have been on Sherdog, to be honest with you, back then. Sherdog was more popular back then.
Okay.
And I read that and I thought, that's interesting. So I put it to the network. I said, listen, I've got a 75-minute interview here with Joe. Why don't we strip it down to 60 minutes and make it into a one-off special called The Voice versus Joe Rogan? And they went with it. They liked it. It rated well. And then they gave the green light to do more episodes. And here we are, 4 or 5 years later, still doing them.
Who's been your favorite guest so far on The Voice Versus?
All of them have been special. In a special way, and I have stories about all of them. To single out one as my favourite is hard. Probably Stone Cold Steve Austin, I think, would be my standout. I was amazed by the guy, his attitude, his personality, his stories, the interview he gave. He gave me a huge compliment saying that in all his years of being interviewed, it was the best interview he'd ever done, which thrilled me. And also Dana White, I think, gave an amazing interview, a very candid, very open, generous interview with Dana, where he really opened up and told me a lot of stuff that we haven't heard from him before. And I like it when I can get guests to open up and reveal a side of themselves that you don't see done in other interviews, and that's part of the process for the Voice Versus, is making sure I watch all the other interviews that are out there that people have done, so I'm not asking the same questions. But I think those are the two that maybe stand out the most, Dana and Stone Cold Steve Austin.
What about Steven Seagal? Do you feel like he revealed anything about his mysterious self that people didn't already know?
You know, a lot of people are quick to bag out Steven. His ego is enormous, but I got on really well with Steven. I really like the guy. Strange figure, curious figure, very paranoid figure. Revealed a lot about his sense of worth, and maybe a lot about his ego, and a lot about his martial arts knowledge as well. But I don't like to say bad things to anyone about anyone. If to me they were kind and they were friendly and they were generous with their time, and Stephen was, and I thank him for it. You know, he's a larger than life character, and everyone's going to have their opinions on someone like Steven Seagal, but I can't say anything bad about him, because to me he was great, and he gave the only ever 1 hour interview of his life, and he made a point of ringing me the night before saying, you know what, I never do 10-minute interviews, let alone an hour interview. He goes, but I respect your knowledge about martial arts, and especially Aikido, and he could tell that I was well researched, and we did the interview.
Very cool.